And now for today's program, which is part of the Wide River Project, an initiative that takes a deep dive and fresh look into the issues that both unite and divide the Black and Jewish communities. Today's guests include Professors Dr. Lillie J. Edwards and Dr. Rafal Pankowski, and they will be in conversation with Moment Editor-in-Chief Nadine Epstein and Race Forward's Eric K. Ward. It's now my pleasure to hand the program over to Nadine and Eric. Nadine?
Welcome, and thank you for joining us for what we believe is a defining conversation. I'm Nadine Epstein, Editor-in-Chief of Moment Magazine and co-founder of the Wide River Project. Today isn't just a program, it's part of a much bigger effort to begin to reshape how we show up for one another.
I'm
Eric?
Eric Ward of Race Forward, and it's great to see you, Nadine. I'm also a co-founder of the Wide River Project here at Moment Magazine, and we're here because the urgency is real. Under Trump's second term, civil rights protections are being gutted, federal power is being centralized, and hate, anti-Semitism, anti-Blackness, xenophobia is not just being tolerated, but leveraged.
And history has taught us that when democracy falls, Black and Jewish communities are among the first to be targeted and to push back. Today is about tapping into that legacy and moving from survival to solidarity.
This is part of the building of a new Black and Jewish alliance, not rooted in nostalgia, but in the realities of the moments and the challenges ahead. At the Wide River Project, we are bringing strategy, not just conversation. Today isn't about fear. This is a conversation about power.
Our first guest is Dr. Lillie J. Edwards, Professor Emerita of History and African American Studies at Drew University. She is a nationally respected scholar of African American intellectual history with a focus on how Black communities have resisted systematic oppression, especially during authoritarian eras. She's also a sought-after public voice who brings clarity and heart to these times, and we've had her before on the Wide River Project, and we're so delighted to have you back, Lillie.
Thank you so very much for inviting me to participate in this very important panel with Rafal also.
Looking forward to speaking with you today. And joining us from Poland is Dr. Rafal Pankowski, co-founder of the Never Again Association. And Rafal is one of Europe's foremost experts on authoritarianism, anti-Semitism, and xenophobia. Rafal has advised governments, NGOs, civil society leaders across the globe and has been on the front lines dealing with authoritarianism as it has surged across Europe. His insights are invaluable and urgent for the US today.
So if you're here,
thank you for having me.
we're so happy to have you, Rafal. If you're here, you're in the right room, and these are the voices you want to be hearing. So, Lillie, let's start with you.
Sure.
Authoritarianism in the US has long relied on anti-Blackness to consolidate power. What echoes do you hear between historical moments of racial repression and what's unfolding today?
Everyone, I hear so many echoes that I've decided I'll share just 3 episodes that may help us understand how these systems of anti-Blackness are actually embedded into our national history. What we're seeing now is not new. This may be a surprising beginning, but when we look at Bacon's Rebellion, 1676, you may have some memory of it in your high school history textbooks, but Bacon's Rebellion in 1676 actually brought together unlikely allies, included indentured servants who are European and African of African descent, landless, impoverished people. It brought together enslaved Africans. It brought together landowners, all fighting against a small elite power structure that held all the political, economic, social power and thwarted the ambitions and opportunities for all of these groups. So they come together in this rebellion against that power structure. In the end, when this rebellion ends and is defeated, this is what the colony of Virginia does. It puts into law and practice a racial divide that gives whites, regardless of their socioeconomic status, it gives them higher status and privilege, and it makes Blackness synonymous with enslavement. This is when enslavement becomes inherited in the state of Virginia. And so you see what this means, that it becomes the ultimate divide and conquer. I will give you privilege, in fact, for abandoning the coalition for ambition and opportunity. We see the same kind of reform movement later on when women and reformists come together, not only for abolition. And the point I want to make is it's not just one fight in the 19th century to end enslavement. There are reform movements going on about child labor, about prison reform, about healthcare, about women's rights to vote. And all of these reformists are moving in and out of all of these social justice movements. And then the last historical example I'll give that is most familiar to all of you, I assume, is post-Reconstruction, right? The end of the 19th century, when the entire apparatus of the national government, the executive branch, legislative branch, judicial branch, all came together to challenge Black people's access to the rights and privileges of citizenship and, in fact, Black people's very existence. In other words, at the end of the 19th century, Black lives did not matter to this nation, and we see that reflected in lynchings, rape, burning schools, burning churches, disenfranchisement, sharecropping, everything that signaled re-enslaving Black people. At the same time, it's the same moment in our history that white privilege and white supremacy also targets Catholics, especially Irish and later Italians and other Eastern and Southern Europeans, and it will also target Jews with quotas, mass-produced caricatures, slurs that enter into the national consciousness and frame all of these groups as, number one, less than human, and number two, not belonging, right, in the American enterprise. And then everything that follows justifies those caricatures. You asked me, Nadine, about where I see these echoes of the past, just these examples I've given you of Bacon's Rebellion, reform movements to end enslavement and other ways of forms of social injustice in the 19th century, and then Reconstruction, post-Reconstruction. This is what I still see. I still see the effort to divide and conquer, just like Bacon's Rebellion. When I see an effort to convince a rural white family in middle America that their lives will be better if a Black child in urban America gets less medical care, less food security, and less clean access to clean water. When we see skilled laborers in a declining industrial sector told that their future is threatened by the research at universities, the divide and conquer is so pervasive, and it includes dividing communities against each other, right? Jewish communities against Jewish communities, Black communities against Black communities, et cetera. Also, I see the echoes of the past when there's an effort to not only disagree, but that's part of our democratic enterprise, right? But to somehow, like the 1950s Red Scare, to give a message that people who disagree with me are not American at all, right? Don't belong here, are not part of our civic and democratic enterprise, and that displacement of people because of disagreements, I think, is something that we see in the past. And then finally, we still see the racial stereotypes. We see this in DEI being somehow conflated with being incompetent and unqualified, when that was never the case, but it's being framed that way. And so I see there the same caricatures of Black people lacking intelligence and lacking excellence and even lacking morality, of immigrants, Jews, being dangerous to the American enterprise. I see that embedded in all of the caricatures that are in some ways embedded into the policies that are trying to strike down efforts for diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'll stop there. I hope I answered your question.
Lillie, it's so interesting to think about that. First, we sometimes walk around with the impression that the level of anti-Semitism and anti-Black attitudes and are things that just appeared 6 or 8 years ago. And it's helpful to get an understanding, as you laid out, about this historical arc of anti-Blackness, of othering. Of course, the caricatures are chilling. We see it across the political divide, right? The caricature of the good and bad Jew, both Jews and non-Jews, right, have been adopting that kind of othering. The idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion being something dangerous, right, rather than aspirational to America. That long arc is so helpful. And Rafal, I think about this when we talk about anti-Semitism. It has long been a tool of authoritarian regimes, and in modern history, of course, we think of Nazi Germany, Nazi Europe, but also globally. And I'm curious, from your perspective, right? You're experiencing having to deal with far right authoritarianism in Europe, helping communities and governments navigate this. How is Trump 2.0 using anti-Semitism and systems of anti-Semitism, and how does it compare to how the far right in Poland or Hungary deploys anti-Semitism? And in your opinion, to bring a little more nuance, is anti-Semitism being deployed in ways that aren't often apparent to us at first glance?
Well, thank you. I agree with what you just said, Eric. Antisemitism has a long history, of course, but it is very much present too. And if we look at what we can call far right nationalism today, if we look at Poland, also the broader region of Central and Eastern Europe, but also globally, we see it is there. If you scratch just a little bit, I believe it is very much at the core of the ideological identity of the global far right in many different ways. And of course, anti-Semitic conspiracy theory is very much at the heart of far right ideology, or if you like to call it neo-fascist ideology. Now in Poland, we have a phrase, anti-Semitism without Jews. Which means that the longevity of anti-Semitism, or the presence or the strength of anti-Semitism, is not really in any way related to the actual size of the Jewish community or the alleged influence of the Jewish community. It is actually independent of it. And in some cases, in some places, anti-Semitism is actually stronger where the Jewish community is very small, and I think this is also important to note. Now, when you mentioned Trump 2.0, I understand we are not just talking about the leader, as important as he is, but also the bigger phenomenon or the bigger MAGA movement, of which Elon Musk, of course, is a very important part. And I think, you know, nothing could be more graphic than the Nazi salute at the presidential inauguration, which we all saw. Despite some people told us we didn't see what we saw, we saw that, and that was, of course, a sort of globally transmitted message. And of course, no country today is an island. We are talking about sort of globalization of the far right, of which Elon Musk is a symbol and also a protagonist. You may or may not remember, Musk was actually in Poland last year in January. He went to Auschwitz around the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz and International Holocaust Remembrance Day. At that time, he said he was very moved and he promised to combat anti-Semitism on his platform. And some months later, we decided to check and see what kind of contents is actually available on his platform in the context of Poland and the Holocaust and Auschwitz in particular. And not just what kind of content is present, but what kind of contents we reported and the platform refused to remove it. And we documented hundreds of cases of openly violent anti-Semitic messages, which we reported, and the platform refused to remove them, which I think is of course one of many examples showing the sort of global scale of violent anti-Semitic propaganda that is freely available, but also is actively pushed by the far right actors, including Elon Musk himself, many times. Now, the last part of your question was about anti-Semitism deployed in ways that might not be obvious to everybody. Well, I would like to mention something from our region that is very topical to us. That is the phenomenon of anti-Semitic rhetoric applied to the context of the war in Ukraine, and also employed in the propaganda targeting Ukrainian refugees in Poland and in the region. You may not have heard of a new version of anti-Semitic conspiracy theory known as Ukropolin. Polin actually means Poland in Hebrew, and Ukro relates to Ukraine. And according to this theory, the war was planned and executed by Jews in order to move the Ukrainian refugees to Poland and create a state dominated by Ukrainian refugees and Jews in the territory of Poland. Of course, that sounds completely nonsensical to all of us, but there is a growing number of people who actually believe in that. And again, it shows that certain anti-Semitic stereotypes and cliches, the longevity of anti-Semitic conspiracy theory is a very real factor, having a very real impact on people's lives in many different ways.
Thank you. That's fascinating. I hadn't heard about that particular conspiracy theory, and it's one that we need to know more about. But back to the United States for a moment here. I think we're going to be going back and forth between Europe and the United States throughout this whole conversation. Lillie, in past eras, how have Black communities balanced resisting with survival when they've been faced with authoritarian threats? Is there some lesson for us now from that? And then And then I'd love you to answer that, but I also really want to have you talk a little bit about how Black and Jewish communities historically found common ground in fighting back against these forces, and what kinds of alliances worked and what didn't.
Mhm. Well, Nadine, I think that surviving, resisting, and thriving define all human communities, no matter what they may confront in terms of the challenges. And so what we're asking today is specific to how do Black communities survive, resist, and thrive. And throughout Black history, from the time of capture in Africa to the present, I think there are some key elements to how the Black community has in fact thrived. First, there have always been strategies and execution of rebellion and escape. And that's true whether it's on the African continent or in bondage aboard ships or even on American soil. Enslavement does not mean that one loses one's creativity and intellect and desire for freedom. And so we have all of these instances, not only Harriet Tubman, of Black people successfully organizing themselves to escape and having white allies who had to help them do that. We also have in the Black experience, I think it's true in all people's experiences, including Jews from a variety of different places of origin throughout Europe, using cultural expressions as a way to survive and resist and thrive. Music, jokes, stories, and of course, religious beliefs, both African and Christian, help to validate Black humanity and also help to construct a condemnation of dehumanization. And then the third one I will offer in terms of these systems of thriving, I will call them, are the ways in which free people of color before the Civil War and then the Black community after the Civil War organized in every arena of life to affirm Black humanity. And this would include the founding of schools, the founding of the production of arts, the founding of social welfare agencies. I mean, people may not realize that Black people created their own orphanages and their own settlement houses, that it wasn't just Jane Addams. Black people created civic organizations to fight for social justice and human rights. And these organizations existed on the local, national, and global levels. And especially at the turn of the century, the early 1900s, we see the organizing of several major organizations, two of which include Jewish founders, the NAACP and the Urban League. But there's this proliferation of Black organizations that include the Black sororities and fraternities and social clubs, Black newspapers and journals, and then, of course, the central role of the Black church. All of these become part of Black survival, resistance, and thriving. Specific to Black Jewish coalitions, though, I think is the work of the NAACP, where when I do public lectures and talk about the founding of the NAACP as part of the progressive movement, right, with Joel Spingarn and Lillian Wald, as well as W.B. Du Bois and Ida B. Wells Barnett, that the NAACP is a progressive organization that really reflects its time. We have the role of the Jewish Black Coalition in the Legal Defense Fund and the Urban League as well. Of course, the Julius Rosenwald Fund that builds over 5,000 schools and teacher housing throughout the South. And then we have the story I've been chronicling that was the research of Gabrielle Simon Edgecombe, about the Jewish refugee scholars who were welcomed at historically Black colleges and universities when white universities throughout this country had quotas on the numbers of Black students as well as Jewish professors. This becomes a story not only of them welcoming these refugee scholars, but when we think about these scholars being in place in the 1940s, 1950s, some of them spent their entire careers at Black colleges and universities. There are generations of students they impacted who went on, in fact, to impact others. The Rosenwald Fund had certain kind of problems, and I would say it's a problem in wanting to limit Black education to vocational education. But at the same time, it was these Rosenwald schools who educated people like Representative John Lewis and the poet Maya Angelou. And so we have these very clear examples of both the Black community understanding how to navigate challenges to its very humanity. And part of navigating that was forming coalitions throughout Black history, right? So the coalitions with Jewish organizations in the 20th century to the present, it's not singular or unique to what I would say is necessary to creating strategies that have longevity and strategies that actually do transform people's lives and make a difference.
Well, I just want to point out something that you mentioned, but just to kind of emphasize it, that there were a number of Black newspapers, including the Chicago Defender, which actually were writing about what was happening to Jews in Eastern Europe and in Germany when most of the mainstream journalism publications were not writing about it. And that's something that really most people just don't know about.
Actually, Nadine, most people, there are several things I find in the public lectures I do, and this is to general audiences, right? Which is what I'm doing in my retirement, is trying to just educate the general public. People have no clue about the history of anti-Semitism in the United States. They, in fact, do see it as some current phenomena as opposed to a form of racism. As I say in my talks, Jews are constructed as a race the way the Irish are constructed as a race, the way Black people are constructed as a race. And all that is used to rationalize those constructions are, in fact, centuries old. And they also have very little knowledge of these coalitions that were formed with the founding of the NAACP. All of us on this webinar may take it for granted that we know about these coalitions in the early 20th century, but most people don't. And so to present it as in some ways, not necessarily typical, but I present it as a sign of hope that these kind of coalitions are indeed possible because they've actually occurred.
And they work.
It's interesting to think about, too. These coalitions absolutely work. We carry our own myths around these coalitions. We talk about the Black Jewish or Jewish Black Alliance as if everybody in the Black community and the Jewish community were on board, when in fact, the majority of folks in both the Black and Jewish community were in opposition or suspicious of that alliance. They didn't support it. They tried to find ways at times to even undermine those leaders within their own communities who were committed, right, to that type of solidarity. And we think it's just now, right? We tend to start history where we were. But the truth is it has been this long relationship, and it's full of caricatures. The idea that Jews just simply showed up in the 1950s and 60s to support Black people is not true, right? It was a combined commitment. I often point to the 1965 Immigration Nationality Act as an example of this, one of the cornerstone civil rights victories in the 1960s. It was fought for, right, to actually counter anti-Semitism and other forms of bigotry in immigration policies that prevented Jews from fleeing the pogroms, from fleeing the Holocaust, not often recognized. We tend to think, why isn't the other side showing up? But the truth is that there are folks who have shown up in leaders in both our communities who have shown up and continue to show up despite the naysayers. But it's interesting to think about that type of resistance. Um, I also know there's divergence in how anti-Semitism, it doesn't look like anti-Black racism. Anti-Black racism doesn't look like homophobia in our society. They get weaponized differently, yet towards similar goals by authoritarian movements. And I'm curious, Rafal, in your experience in Europe, what are the different ways that bigotries have been weaponized around specific communities, different communities, yet to try to move the goal to strengthen authoritarian government or leader?
Well, thank you very much, Eric. Well, when we talk about anti-Semitism, or we talk about anti-Black racism, or other types of hatred, of course, it is largely about the community that is on the receiving end. Yes, it is about the Jews, it is about the Black people and other communities, other minorities. But I believe it is also very much about something else that is very much related to all those types of hatred. That is the sort of general hostility to otherness, a hostility towards diversity, hostility against a certain set of democratic values, democratic culture, human rights, minority rights, you name it. This is what unites or brings together all those types of hate, and I believe in the case of Poland and Central and Eastern Europe, those protagonists of hate, of different types of hate, are usually the same. So the homophobic campaigners are usually the same people who are running anti-Semitic campaigns and running campaigns against migrants and refugees. And in the case of Poland, those campaigns are also increasingly and more openly racist in terms of anti-Black racism, which in our context is a relatively new phenomenon. But I could not stress enough. I believe they have a lot in common. Now around 2015, that was a sort of important year in Polish political history. The year that sort of symbolizes the crisis of democratic values and the right-wing populist rule in Poland. But it was also the year of the so-called refugee crisis in the south of Europe, which didn't really have any direct impact on Poland, because very few of those refugees were going to settle in Poland anyway. But it was framed in a very negative way in Polish media and politics as a kind of threat to Polish identity. And around that time, many people actually said that maybe Islamophobia is replacing anti-Semitism as the main type of hatred in our region. And I think that was never the case. I think Islamophobia in this instance supplemented anti-Semitism as a form of hatred. It didn't replace it. And those different types of hatred, they coexist happily, if I can put it that way. And let me quote the infamous 5 points platform of the Confederation which is a far-right party in Poland nowadays, popular, especially among young voters, especially among young men, I should say. This platform is very simple. It's very easy to remember. They say they are against Jews, gays, European Union, abortion, and taxes. This is unfortunately a perfect example of how different types of far-right ideology coexist. One of them may take prominence at one point, but they are all still there, sort of reinforcing each other. Thank you.
It's helpful to think about. I wonder, right, as we kind of look at this kind of history, forgotten history that you've talked about, Lillie, we've forgotten what we have done and achieved together, how we have come together. We understand, Rafal, what you have laid out is, right, different communities are under attack. It can leave us believing that we are isolated or siloed. But I want to shift in another direction. We can talk about the far right. We can talk about systems of oppression, the need to come together, but also that need to address the real tensions and mistrust amongst communities that seem to have been stoked in recent years online, in politics, even within social movements. These divisions seem to be being exploited. And I'd love to talk a little bit about how we move through, not around it, towards a solidarity of mutual respect and accountability that's real. And Lillie, Black communities are already being hit with rollbacks in voting rights, in making real the practice of civil rights, right, through diversity and equity and inclusion. How do we protect leadership in organizations and build internal strength in this moment, despite the real internal tensions and the external assault on the 1960 civil rights gains?
Well, Eric, I think one of the, or here are a few of the lessons I think we learned from the history of these kinds of oppressive measures and what they have taught us that we might consider in the present as we confront the present challenges. One is that we need to organize on local, state, and national levels. And so in some ways, the most visible organization we see are some of the court cases being taken up by NAACP, the ACLU, colleges, universities, and all of the friendly briefs that accompany those on the national level. And we sometimes forget that on the local level, on the neighbor to neighbor, church to synagogue, club to club, parent to parent, neighborhood to neighborhood, that those conversations on the local level do have an impact on changing people's perspectives and also creating coalitions that will kind of fight the good fight, right? And that many of these organizations, like the NAACP, for example, have local chapters doing specifically local work around DEI, around affordable housing, around equity in education, around equity in hiring, around voting rights and public safety. Bringing police officers and public safety to the table in conversation, right? And so I would say that there's a template that we have of coalition building from the past on those levels that we can replicate. Two, I think we can continue to work through the existing coalitions that we have, but I want us to consider new coalitions. So in your list, Eric, I think you included voting rights, DEI, public safety as spaces where we see rollbacks through especially executive orders and also through Elon Musk and Doge. Perhaps there are new coalitions we can create similar to the ones that were created and invented in the past, based upon the vast variety of constituencies that are being impacted. And here I'm talking about negative impacts, especially economic impacts, right? On working class and middle class families, on veterans, on people who are seeking affordable health care, on young people seeking education and jobs, on something as fundamental as how we respond to natural disasters, right? Floods, hurricanes, tornadoes, fires, which pretty much includes the entire country. Are there new coalitions we build based upon joint interests where this whole conversation about who is and isn't American enough, or who is or isn't qualified to sit at the table of American democracy? And so it's, kind of that's not the conversation when you're talking about, is this state in middle America protecting its farmers' economy, which is also protecting American industry, which is also impacting food security in rural and urban areas equally. I think Rafal said something, and you did also, Eric, that's very important. People are responding, many people, unfortunately, are responding to myths. We can also call them lies, things that don't even exist. When if we bring to the table the reality of what does exist and what the problems are, we will see, or we should see in those conversations, profound unity in what challenges are presented to all of us. And then the notion that somehow there's a problem with voting or a problem with DEI or a problem with public safety begins to shift into the realm of reality, one would hope. And finally, let me say one more thing quickly. We need to reclaim civics and patriotism in our progressive language and in our activism. That has been co-opted by conservatives to somehow say that those of us who are progressive, who are fighting for equity and inclusion, are un-American. And I suggest that we need to reclaim that language of civics and language of patriotism and language of for the people and by the people, the language of inalienable rights. We need to speak those as our platform.
Thank you, Lillie. That's really helpful. Rafal, wedge politics, that's pitting groups against one another, is a core authoritarian tactic. I'm wondering how you see this is obviously played out in Europe. You've talked a little bit about it. Are there any parallels that you observe that are, playing out in the United States? And can you give us an example of something in Europe and let us know if you can see a successful antidote based on the East European story?
Thanks. That's a difficult question, of course, and of course these are complex issues. I already alluded to the debates around anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, for example, and I think it's fine to debate them and compare them. It's actually very necessary in some ways, but it can also be very tricky. As we all know, and I think that the very real temptation and a dangerous temptation, in fact, is what we can call a competition of victimhood, which happens a lot, and sometimes is difficult to avoid, but it can also be very toxic. And I think this is something that we have observed in different ways in different countries. And of course, what is happening in the Middle East today, in Gaza, in Israel, is not helping us in the fight against anti-Semitism. It is not helping us in the fight against Islamophobia. But if there is any solution, I believe, despite everything, we just have to keep building bridges of solidarity, empathy across communities. And I know it is easier said than done, of course. But well, I also agree we need to look at some of the traditions that are also very valuable as a kind of inspiration. And there is a tradition we also have in Poland, the tradition of Polish revolutionaries going back to the 19th century, and the slogan "For your freedom and ours," which was an internationalist slogan that I believe is as relevant as ever. And I believe, well, this is the kind of motto that that can be inspiring today. Thanks.
Very helpful. I mean, thinking about that piece, Lillie, let's get specific. What does a durable Black Jewish solidarity look like in practice, not just symbolically, in a moment like this? What are one or two things that you might say, here's what that would look like right now?
Well, I have only two for you. I wish I had three, but I can come up with two. One is the education space. It's a space where I've been working both for K through 12, but also in higher education. As spaces where we can see coalitions and partnerships occur. When I was chair of Pan-African Studies at Drew University for, I think it was 27 years, the Drew's Holocaust Genocide Studies Center and Pan-African Studies did joint programming all the time, organic to the subjects we were studying, and in some ways embedded into our mission to teach our students and provide for the community the context where education requires a moral consciousness, right? In the ways we study and the way we elevate humanity. I was told at the time, this was for the past couple of decades, that kind of joint programming between essentially a Black Studies program and a Holocaust Studies program was unusual, and that we were distinctive and unique in kind of moving back and forth with our programming and courses and speakers and panels, the kind that you're having today. I would hope that higher education is a space where those kind of partnerships can occur, not only for college students, but in terms of bringing the community into an intellectual space that is also trying to address people's real current problems. Also, in terms of K through 12 space, as chair of the New Jersey Amistad Commission, the Amistad Commission works with the Holocaust Commission in creating some joint curricula, right? So that students, in fact, within the classroom are seeing forms of discrimination and forms of redressing those in a joint conversation about anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism. The second space where I would say we could see Black Jewish solidarity in practice would in some ways be the obvious space, and that is faith communities. Bringing together Christian churches and synagogues should play a pivotal role, especially again in that local space, providing a space where not just to talk about coalitions partnership, but it should be a space where we can also talk about what are the challenges to our coalitions and partnerships. How has American society throughout its history embedded in all of our minds, right? Constructions of race that unless we put them on the table, they are become part of our consciousness, even if we aren't fully aware of it. And so the kind of awareness of the ways we hold these anti-Semitic caricatures and images and slurs in our heads, and anti-Black constructions of who Black people are or who Black people can't be. I think that sacred space within faith communities should also be a space of truth-telling, and at the same time is affirming of all of our humanity.
Thank you, Lillie. I want to go back to Poland just for a minute, Rafal. You know, Poland voted out a far-right government and to some extent has deprogrammed some of the previous government policies. And I'm wondering what we can learn from this. Is there something that American civil society can learn from?
Well, thank you. That's an interesting question. Well, historically, Poland had one of the biggest social movements of all time. That was Solidarity in the 80s, of course, which was in itself a kind of coalition between workers and intellectuals. But like you said, more recently, yes, we had a sort of big wave of civil society activism in the face of right-wing populism, especially the women's rights movement and also the movement in defense of the independence of the judiciary. These were important mobilizations. Now, whether or not there are lessons to be learned from that, it's not for me to say. But on the other hand, a lot of the issues we've been talking about today are common issues, are global issues. And of course, well, we didn't get to vote in the US election, but the result of the election also has an impact on us. And what I think many of us are concerned about or worried about is the emergence of an authoritarian or a fascist axis, between Putin and Trump, and that is mentioned in many conversations nowadays. And what is also mentioned is, from our perspective, the relative weakness or maybe timidity of the protest movement in the US, which may be a question of our perception, but this perception is also a fact. And of course we know very well about the very strong tradition of protest movements in the US, starting from the civil rights movement and many other protest movements throughout history. So I think with this kind of models, maybe we would hope that civil society in the US today could produce more protest and more inspiration for the for the global resistance against the far right.
But is there something a lesson for us from what happened in Poland that you can share with us?
I don't think there is a magic trick. Of course, we all wish we had it, but again, I think solidarity is very key. Again, it's just a word, but I believe it is a very important value, and sort of very very key idea to start with. Solidarity, cross-sectional, in terms of all the many different groups and communities we mentioned today, and also many communities and groups that we didn't get to mention.
It's very helpful. We often treat solidarity as if it is an easy thing to do, and I think many of us over the last 7 years have really come to learn just how difficult it is. An easy, simple concept that really takes a level of discipline and commitment that is hard to meet. And when we don't, it leaves us vulnerable. We are now at the close of this conversation, the first of many. What we've heard here today, Nadine, right, wasn't just history. It was a warning, a strategy session, and a mirror held up to where we stand right now in the U.S. And as we thank Lillie and Rafal for joining us, the question that comes to me now is, what will we do with it?
Well, the truth is we're standing on the shoulders of generations of people who have faced, and they've risen higher. And we know from history that Black and Jewish communities have each broken chains and reshaped nations. And we can do this again.
We absolutely can, and we should commit to this, right? The lessons we hear from Rafal and Lillie today that stand out for me are, right, to protect each other against hate, repression, and division, to speak to each other honestly, even when it's hard, and to build together for the long haul, not just the crisis. That is a foundation of a new Black Jewish alliance, and we need one now.
I'd like to add one more thing to commit to, and that I think we need to lean into complexity. We have to avoid simple narratives. Simple narratives. There's so many simple narratives, and some of them are conspiracy theories, and some of them are just the things we say every day, and they pull us apart. They whip up hate. They prevent nuance. They prevent trust. They prevent people coming to an agreement and working together. So we need to push back on them. I want to say that our next step, your next step, is to share this program. Moment Magazine's Wide River Project is curating a space for serious and courageous conversation. We don't want to let this energy fade. Stay connected and bring others. Let's break down the alienation that so many people are experiencing, and let's push back against simple narratives that are dividing us.
I think we understand that at the end of the day, right? Don't let this energy fade, right? Your next step for those listening is share this program. Moment Magazine's Wide River Project will continue to curate a space for serious and courageous conversation. Share these with others and stay connected and bring others, help break down the alienation so many of us are experiencing. At the end of the day, when democracy falls, Blacks and Jews will be the first to go. But also remember, when democracy falls, we will also be the first to rise. I want to thank our guest again, Nadine, and thank you again and Moment Magazine for giving us the space to wrestle with complexity and nuance and uncomfortability. That space is rare these days, where folks love binaries, one side good, the other bad. Thank you for giving us an alternative, an adult way to wrestle with the complexities of a democracy.
Thank you, Eric, for being part of this. Thank you so much, Lillie. Thank you so much, Rafal. It's been a really, really meaningful conversation.